development that I have a slingshot and it will shoot. It's
At least I have glasses on.
in case,
Get my eyes.
in case anyone misbehaves, we are working on a list of decision points we have to make and questions we have to ask. But we were working our way, Senator Brock, I don't know how long you were here for the discussion.
I was here until 3:30.
Oh, okay, so you missed the whole OPR
I
discussion.
didn't.
All right, we're
They
not
were
gonna
just coming
get,
in as I left.
we're not gonna get back to that for probably a week. I gather some of the issues may have been worked out. I'm gonna try and find the emails I got, but apparently there was some misunderstanding if people were getting the same number of emails I got on the child care worker licensing. So
I haven't gotten a single one, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
you don't get anything up there.
We don't have mail delivered.
Yeah, the emails.
Which said we don't have mail delivered, that's why.
I told you I could fix the email thing. My daughter's the first one to tell me there was white smoke coming out of the Vatican.
Oh, yeah, I want to see that.
Okay. So anyway, we were talking about, we've got base and weights. We haven't had a presentation on the base. We have on the weights. We have the Tammy Colby formula. We have weights that are calculated on the future state, which I think some of us are having a hard time wrapping our head around a future state. I've asked Ezra to put the enhanced, and I will ask the administration tomorrow morning if they can help us, if they can lay out the enhanced. Remember, Ezra had the blocks and it was the base amount and, but everything was laid out, the total cost. But the enhanced proposal, which I gather is an extension of the original bill, wasn't laid out like that. So he said he would try and get that laid out so we can at least look at 3 blocks. We will do a presentation on the base maybe on Monday. We're meeting from 1 to 5. Can you be here?
When
Yes.
when you say a
The
presentation.
foundation. Can we haven't gone through really the foundation amount of base.
So I think that yesterday Ezra talked through the adjusted EV
Yeah.
model, the
Administration
House passed
originally the House,
before, the
yeah.
enhanced EV model, and then the Senate Ed
So
foundation formula.
yeah, we need to sit down and have like a discussion here about, do we want to take any of those? I need to get something more on what the enhanced is.
What I've heard was literally when I've heard these things, and I go back also to the summer study committee on education funding that I was on a couple of years ago.
Okay,
And I know, I see that Tammy Colby waits, so on and so forth, all the way along these various people waiting, but I don't have a good understanding, or at least comfort level, I'll put it that way, comfort level. I've heard it as to where these numbers came from. Why, for example, is the cost of educating an English language speaker the same number in a place that has lots of English of people who need English language instruction, as opposed to one kid in Essex County who needs it? I've never understood that, and it's never been able to explain in a way that makes sense to me, quite frankly.
so let's,
I do, to your point, I remember 4 years ago, whenever the original pupil
Yeah.
weighting report that came out, maybe it was initiated before. I was on Senate Ed, Tammy Colby did walk through her empirical
Mhm.
scientific approach with the correlations of costs through a lot of different sources, but that was for the taxing formula.
Mhm.
So I do remember walking through that. It was dense, but I agree with you that I have not seen that analysis for what the number she came up with this past January.
Yeah, I heard the analysis explained, it didn't make sense to me, quite frankly, it just
I
didn't.
don't see that
Was she
documentation.
changed in January, maybe a little later,
Yeah.
in February, because she canceled once, we were on the floor and we canceled and she's very hard to come by. And now I understand she has a broken shoulder and, she did come in here a couple weeks ago. But I would feel like Senator Hardy may be able to explain to us basically how weights are calculated. My understanding is, I don't know if she just takes the total overall costs that schools are spending, looking at their budget, or if there is a national standard. I know the evidence base is a computer algorithm based on national data. The cost base, I have a feeling we're gonna have a hard time getting Tammy Colby in here in time,
Okay.
but Senator Brock had a question
Yeah, it's
about.
regarding the study that we were on when we,
Yep.
yeah, looked at weights and so on. And, you know, I heard Tammy Colby and others explain the concept regarding weights, particularly say for English as a second language, when we looked at it. And I quite frankly, I never understood it. It never got through me as making sense. When you take, let's say, people in Chittenden County, or take Winooski as a classic example, who
Mhm.
need training in language, in which you have lots of them in one place,
Mhm.
and you have one kid in Essex County who needs it,
Mhm.
how the rate is the same in both. That never got through to me as making any sense. And maybe I missed something.
No, we did talk about this quite a bit,
Yeah, I know.
and the way that we ended up managing it was we created essentially a small categorical aid for school districts with fewer than, I think, 20, is it, Julia? I think it's school districts with fewer than 20, or something like that, or
Yeah.
50 maybe, kids with ELL. We give them $50,000 so that they have enough money
Mhm.
so they have the 50 plus the weight
The weight.
amount,
Mhm.
so they could hire a teacher.
Yeah,
Because one of the concerns we had was that with so few kids, they aren't gonna get enough
precisely.
capacity.
But then it's those
to be
with
able to
medium
hire a
levels of
teacher.
kids. So it's again, the overall, in terms of how much money we gave them, I had an impossible task to try to correlate that to the money that the school district actually had to spend and what it cost to do that.
Right, and
That was
so,
all.
I mean,
There was an adjustment there, it sounds like.
yeah, it was the compromise between, you probably remember the whole conversation about whether the category. So this was the compromise to help the school districts that had ELL students, but didn't have enough EL students to really raise the revenue that they needed.
And I thought the question was, you know, when you compromise like this, does that even make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I don't exactly, and that's what I think that's sort of my point with what that Senate Education Committee did with their foundation formula is that they did all these compromises, backing it to numbers and everything.
Right.
So their formula is not empirically derived. It doesn't really make any sense. So, but another thing that to take into consideration with the weights is that the weights are also the multiple weights for sparsity and small schools go to many of the rural schools that and the more urban and suburban schools don't get those weights. So the sparsity weight is supposed to take into consideration the higher cost of maybe having fewer kids and smaller schools in more remote regions. But
Okay, but the basic way is that the cost is, that the weight is calculated, is looking at what schools are spending on educating students with second language, or what their spending, and I'm sure there's some national empirical data that goes into that. And then it gets massaged probably in a computer to come up with a cost per kid, because
Well, I would think that the school in Essex County would know how much it costs,
Oh,
as would
they
the
do.
school in Winooski. And with the school in someplace else.
Yeah.
The numbers would be different, but how you mash that together, cost per pupil in specific cases and circumstances in which you reimburse a district, that part is eluding me.
May not be that different, actually.
Well, it may not, I don't know, but we certainly didn't see that.
The model
Yeah.
that Professor Colby runs is based on the actual cost of educating students in Vermont using Vermont data.
Mhm.
And it holds things constant. So when you're trying to figure out how much does it cost for ELL students, it's going to hold the sparsity constant, it's going to hold poverty constant, and just really isolate the cost for ELL, and then do the same thing with all the other weights. And also it calculate the base that is supposed to include all of the costs that are not taken care of in the weights.
Well, I guess
Except
one
for
of the questions
capital
is
and
after
debt
we've done this,
service.
and now we've used it for however many years, as to whether anybody's looked back to say, did it do what we thought it was supposed to do?
Well, I mean,
Yes,
really, that's a
actually,
really good
yeah.
question, because
Yes, there's data now.
it's only, the new weights have only been in effect for this was the first
Yeah.
school year that they were.
But
fully
they're already
in effect.
bearing fruit. They are already bearing fruit.
But I mean, I do think it somewhat begs the question of, should we wait and see if it worked before we change it again? There was this big bump last year because the implementation didn't go well,
Mhm.
and now we're, blowing up our entire system over it. And one could make the argument, I think Senator Gulick has,
Mhm.
that maybe we should wait and see if, as this is implemented for a number of years, whether or not this is working, but.
okay, but Tammy Colby came back with the new set of weights with this, right?
She did, she based on a foundation formula, and
Well, that's right,
the-
this is on a
different-
taxing
the
capacity
different
formula,
formula.
so that's why but we have talked about. We had some big winners and big losers, when we went one or two. We had adjustments elsewhere, but when we go to this, because those weights have only been in effect for a year or two,
Mhm.
to see if we can't find a system that won't shell shock those same schools again, that they've just adjusted to the pluses or minuses.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I mean, using my district that I know the best as an example, it was a district that lost taxing capacity during the pupil weighting, and they also would lose funding during the foundation formula. So it will be a double shock for the same for some of the same school districts.
Okay, so
And that's one to Senator Chittenden's point that you've made really well, is that implementing a foundation formula without also doing comprehensive and well thought out and well structured governance change is going to have a really big impact on some districts that aren't going to be able to navigate or move within there.
no, we're gonna it'll break.
It'll break them
Right.
because they won't be able to get the kind of economies of scale or help from their neighbors.
Well, I would think,
And that
though,
is a real concern of mine, is that it's kind of gotta be together.
well, I would think that on a district by district basis, if you don't want to put a ton of work on these newly formed districts, they ought to at least have an idea of what the cost is going to be to compare it to how much they're going to get once we, create such a form, and see if there's a big difference, and then have some mechanism to adjust it on the fly, rather than waiting 2 years to prove that something that we see isn't working.
Right.
I am happy to provide, I have anecdotal evidence for sure from my district that if they are working and they are doing exactly what they were supposed to do. And if you want, I could probably get numbers and actual, empirical data to share. But yeah, the issue with the winners and losers is just that you could argue that I'm using we as my district, but we had lower taxing capacity than it should have for a long time, and then it got adjusted to where it was supposed to be. And I literally lived in a district that had lower taxing capacity and worked in one that had higher taxing capacity, so I could see in real time the disparities between the two. It was fascinating. So we didn't, it's not like winners and losers, it's like, oh, we made the playing field the appropriate playing field.
But that playing field has only been like that for a year and a half now, because they
Okay.
just went into.
Yeah, I would like to.
So can we say one of our goals is we want to limit the impact of changing weights or making any major financial adjustments that they need to be phased in because we just did the weights. I don't care if we did taxing capacity or not. They had an impact. If we're doing other weights based on a foundation formula, then unless we really messed it up, the fiscal impact should come out the bottom line the same, because we're doing, if we're going down in your weight, if we try and get the weights at the same rate translated that we had in taxing capacity, if we do that calculation correctly, if the base is going up and your weights are coming down, but they should end up.
They don't
It-
actually,
well,
because
see,
there are
that's-
districts that did not use their taxing capacity. that they
Yes,
got.
okay,
So
but-
another example in my district is
That's
the
their
Slate
choice.
Valley School District. Forgive me for using you as an example out there,
No.
but they were the district that took 6 times to pass their budget
They-
last year.
They
They
the
have
only one that surpassed Barry.
Yeah, they have a very low per pupil
Yeah.
spending. In the foundation formula, they will get a lot more money per pupil because they'll go up.
Right.
And so they will have a big bump in their amount.
Right.
It will also increase their tax rate fairly significantly, although we haven't seen those numbers quite, and I know Julia's
Well,
working on them. But
Get them yet.
so some of the places that will get more money per student are also gonna see
Okay.
the biggest tax rate increases. And some of the districts that are gonna lose the most amount of money per pupil are gonna probably see tax decreases. But that is also sort of based on what they've been spending and their voters have been approving over the last few
Okay,
years.
so is there an indication that that's going to happen? That are low spending, whether or not they're high performing or not towns, because they have been voting, and I'm thinking Barry's city town is going to be one of them. Because they have been voting to limit their educational spending. When we go in with a statewide tax that will support, they're perhaps getting more money, but it could or probably will result in their being charged more money than they have been.
Yeah, I think that general intuition is fair to assume. I'm still working on finalizing the tax rate modeling, working on trying to do that in consensus with the tax department.
So I can mention that tomorrow morning, that this is a concern that we're seeing, is that for high spending towns, and I'm gonna assume Harwood, Stowe, and Montpelier are amongst them, that they could see their property taxes go down, but that your really low spending towns who are, I would be willing to bet, your poorer towns, Slate Valley is poor. Yeah.
They're lower income than
Yeah.
many places.
In many places. And because they have not voted to tax themselves, that when we tax them, there is a very good chance that their tax rates are going to go up. Just so the governor knows that.
Yeah, I think that's in general, fair to assume, and I don't want to testify that is what will happen until I've had a chance to finish the modeling. The final piece that I will just add is when we're talking about high spending and low spending, we're referring to the education spending per weighted pupil, right? So there's different ways of thinking about measuring spending, and because spending per weighted pupil is what is impacting the local adjustment to homestead property tax rates right now. That's where you see the districts that have higher spending per weighted pupil have a corresponding higher tax rate.
But how long has that been? How long has that been done? In other words, to have the weighted pupil to be able to look at some consistency over a period of several years.
So prior to Act 127, it still was being done. It was being done with equalized pupils,
Mhm.
where essentially all of the pupil weights were applied, and then there was the equalization mechanism.
Mhm.
That brought them back down. That equalization mechanism was mathematically neutral. It didn't matter in terms of the arithmetic. I believe there's been some sort of local adjustment along these lines since Act 60, but I don't know the.
Well, the thing that I'm thinking about is I know that in the past, analytics, I've looked at cost per pupil and then laid it on performance on standardized tests to say, is there any correlation between the two? And I found a lot of outliers that, as well as a number that had very low spending and very high performance. And that I was looking for, and then trying to figure out why, which is another subject.
I don't think we're gonna fix that in this
But
conversation.
what I'm saying is this going to exacerbate that by giving some districts more spending than they've had in the past, not looking at performance at all, but then laying it on that same thing. And again, seeing what happens, because that one question is it spending alone is making a difference in the ability to perform well? And what I looked at, the last time I looked at it that way, that was not the case necessarily.
Okay, so we connect increased spending, and I don't,
So what meeting are you taking these notes for? Who are you asking these questions? Because I'm not sure that who are you asking these questions of, Madam Chair? Okay, yeah, but you were.
but I'm also, well, I have a meeting with the administration at 8 tomorrow morning.
They will not have the answers to
And,
these
but
questions.
I think what I'm trying to do is to communicate the concerns that this committee is grappling with, which is we're concerned that we can see some swings in property taxes. We won't know until we do that, but I think I don't want us, whenever we're finished here, to go out with a bill. And the first year we switch over to have things not be what we told people they were
Right.
going to be.
Well,
I
I think
want to
one
make
thing-
sure we, as far as we possibly can, speak the truth. And if it's not going to save dollars, or it's not going to save dollars until, and I think that's what it is, then we need to be honest about that. And then we have been buying down the tax rate for 2 years. We need to have a transition plan that may or may not require that the tax rate get bought down in some places, or that we raise more money in other places, both of which are not popular, but I think we need to be honest with people. We are asking us to make probably the biggest change. I mean, I can't think of a change that we've asked people to make that has this much impact on a community, on all communities, on our kids, on our parents, and on our taxpayers. And I think we have to do it. because we don't have the money to do the present system. But I think we need to be honest with what we're doing.
You first.
So on the same point, besides the concern that this ultimately may result in higher tax rates for the low spending, the low appetite districts. But the other concern I would connect back to that same vein to my point yesterday is if we don't go forward in conjunction with new districts, this is what I imagine happening in that fallback scenario. You're going to get districts like Vic-Berry or Slate Valley, which are going to get more money. They're going to get more money, and then that means they won't have to ask the voters to approve any supplemental district spending. But I still think they're going to be frugal, and so they're probably going to carry that money over. Maybe they'll spend it on facilities, maybe they'll invest in new programs, but I just don't see them as being motivated to want to spend any time, resource, or attention in trying to help the neighbors combine or merge with their neighbors. That's why I think it's so critical that we as the state legislature couple these districts with this new foundation formula. Otherwise, then right next door, you're going to get these districts which are going to have to start cutting to the bone, and they're going to be like going to the other neighbor, please come on, we got to do something different. And they're going to say, well, we don't have any time yet. So that's my concern with this change in foundation formula without the governance change. And that's what I've heard from the administration
No,
all along.
we have to have the governance, but we have to move up. Yeah, and we are not going to be able to do that because we just plain don't have the schools that are big enough to do the consolidation in. And I've also got to note your point that teachers cost more in Chittenden County.
Yes.
So it's going to cost more to,
My wife's one of them. She's worth every penny.
I'll tell her you said.
she watches it.
People spend less on kids, that's what.
Well, I mean,
You know,
yeah, the idea is not to bring down anybody's
right.
quality of education. They've talked about raising up teachers' salaries elsewhere. But the cost of living is still higher in Chittenden County than it is. Well, I don't know about St. Albans anymore, but probably it's
North.
I mean,
has something she
yeah.
has been wanting to say.
okay.
Thank you. Since you're writing down concerns.
Yeah.
My concerns, along with what Senator Chittenden just said, which I enthusiastically agree with. One is that a point that Senator Hardy made earlier, we haven't really had time to see the effects of the weights, and we haven't had this, we're just starting to adjust to this, the new weighting formula, or not new, the adjusted weights from 127. I'm also worried that we are reacting in a fairly, and I'm going to use the word violent, but you know what I mean, in a very dramatic way to, and I'm sorry, read some articles, it's all out there, post-COVID reality, which is still around. We're still kind of, recovering from COVID and recovering from the infusion of federal dollars, frankly. But also, the cost drivers that are not being addressed in all of this, which we know what they are, and we know that one of them is healthcare. So all of those things, give me pause at this particular moment, not to mention the uncertainty from the federal level. So that's where I'm looking at.
Yeah, and I would add to that I think, one of the things that the House bill did pretty well was they had a very reasonable timeline for everything to go into effect. And I understand the urgency of wanting to do something, but I am concerned that in the urgency of wanting to do something, we will do more harm than good to our districts, and to ultimately to our students, because already the Senate Education Committee underfunded and created a unworkable foundation formula, which is exactly what the people have been
We are
concerned about.
going to do our own foundation formula. We can. I think that the House did a credible job. I think the problem was the numbers didn't say what they were supposed to say. It's all going to get hashed out in conference.
I know, but I think that it sort of underscores some of the concerns of the, the timeline that's too fast, a formula that's not a empirically based and viable formula. That is setting up this and a redistricting plan that maintains the same kind of inefficient and nutty structure that we have now without a real thoughtful approach to potentially creating new districts. And I think that is going to set us up to really potentially do damage to our education system. And so I think we need to really get back to a much more thoughtful and empirically based and reality based timeline and formula and process.
Okay, but none of these do the redistricting. Nobody. They've all put it off to somebody else in the summer.
Well, the governor's special plan did, didn't it?
He
Yeah,
just
the
said
5
9 districts, but he never 5 districts. But
I think
they didn't, nobody said, well, these are the schools that are gonna stay open. This is who the middle schools are gonna be. This is where the high school is gonna be. Nobody's assessed the buildings in those areas or talked about how we're gonna get the money to pay for fixing the leaky roofs. They all seem to have leaky roofs, so.
No, to me, I look at what we've got. and
Just jump in. This
Keep
is
going.
committee discussion.
Keep going.
defer to the elder.
No, I want to hear what you have to say.
I'm just concerned about what we are, and we've got some numbers and so on, and in many cases, I'm not sure where those ending numbers came up from, because when I ask questions that seem to be a lot of things, why, and these are more fundamental, going back to why does Vermont cost so much more to educate a kid than everybody else? 1, 2, why do we have more adults in our classroom than everybody else? 3, and those to me are very fundamental questions, and I still don't see how we're going to save anything if we don't have the answers to those questions and affect the changes that are directed to them. So I just see a big gap.
Okay. Good luck, Frisco.
We don't have the continuity.
No, I'm just curious. I keep hearing that we're underfunding the foundation formulary right out of the gate.
Mhm.
Senate Ed is funding the exact amount of money that school districts passed this year with their foundation formula. So how are we underfunding? We're underfunding the increase that the House did, $35 million more than we're spending.
Right, and the foundation formula that the Senate Education Committee created they backed into that formula. And they didn't do an empirically based analysis of what the foundation amount is that's required to actually fund schools and what the weights are that are required for different types of students to fund their education to meet the standards that the state has. And so by taking, and I believe it was the amount that was spent in the 23-24 school year, not the 25-26 school year. So it's this, I think do you remember, Julia?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The amount that the Senate Education Committee used, was it the 23-24 school year or the 24-25 school year?
FY25, so the 24-25.
Okay, so it was this year, so
1.8.
it doesn't actually, it's not next year's budgets.
No.
So,
Well, we have an inflator.
yeah, but the inflator is basically to move up the amount from what the sort of real number is that you start with. And they started with this year and applied it to 2 years from now instead of for 3 years from now, instead of starting from what it actually costs to educate students.
So we're not spending enough right now.
You could argue that not every school is providing an adequate education.
I don't think
Or summer.
they're not taking into consideration the full cost, because there's more that gets spent on education that the education's funding amount.
But
Northfield, Norwich.
no,
That there are, there
it's
are
not, it's small. town.
other pockets of money that go in.
Yeah, so I mean, we can do empirical weights. We can do the Senate's base. We can do
The base, we have to match the weights with the base. They're not
to come out with what?
the base. So if you do a different base with the weights are proportional to the base. So if you have a 0.2 weight, that's 20%.
Okay,
And if you have, it's 20% of 14,870 or 20% of
Okay,
15.
yeah, but if we-
033. So it comes up with a different amount of money.
But
It's not a
is
cost-based
the-
analysis.
so Colby starts with it costs $200 more to educate a kid with English as a second language. And so if it's the $100 base, that 200. But if you have a different base, it's a $300 base, then it doesn't cost $200 more.
No, so what the weights are, they translate into a cost.
Yeah.
But you, if you have, can I write on the whiteboard?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know exactly to write on with.
Yeah,
And I
So,
removed
and
the
Julia,
pen
please
case.
jump in if I'm doing this wrong, okay? So I'm gonna take easy numbers. So if you have a base of $10,000, say this is the base, and you have a weight of 0.1, so 0.1, because so 10% more to
Okay.
educate some kind of kid.
Like the high school one right now.
Some
Yeah, so that would, so $10,000 by 0.1 is $100, right? Am I doing this right? Because I'm doing math in public on YouTube, is it not?
We moved the decimal place once, so it'd be 1,000.
No, because that would be 10, yes, 1,000, yep. Okay, $1,000 more. Thanks, Tom. You should come up and help.
It's
So
always
that's
harder when you-
$1,000 to educate whatever this kid is. This is, you know,
It was
$1,000. But so that's the cost
right.
that's based on this
That-
foundation
So
amount.
the total
and
amount
this
there is
weight.
11.
So if you change the foundation amount to 11,000 and
Uh-huh.
you keep the weight at
You're
0.01,
missing a zero.
1,100.
11,000, thank you. And you keep the weight at 0.1, when you do this math, you get 1,100, right? So it's the same weight,
Yeah,
but it's a
Different
different
base.
base and you're getting $100 more. But the analysis shows that it only costs $1,000 to extra is what you need.
analysis,
But-
okay,
So the weights and the bases go together
right.
so that you get the cost, because they're cost-based analysis. This is the cost that it
Okay.
costs to fund whatever this category is.
Okay.
So-
but
And
this
so if you
Colby chart-
change the base, you have to change the weights to correspond with the base in order to
Okay.
come up with the cost.
I guess what I haven't seen
Is
is
this- am I, okay,
Colby's gotta start with a cost. She's calculated the cost is $1,000. So she has looked at,
right.
What it costs.
what it costs, and I'd
Right.
say that's probably on average, it's massaged somehow. But
So if you
beyond my skills, so we're paying, yeah, we're gonna.
And you
take
can't
that
mix
thing.
and match them. You can't say, oh, I'm gonna take a weight from this memo and this
Right, no,
analysis and this thing
But
that I
if-
liked over
but-
here.
The cost
come
is
up
the
with-
cost.
The
Right.
cost is the cost,
Okay,
so it's $1,000
so
to
if
do that.
it's $1,000 a student, then, and you're spending 1,100. Even someone with my math skills should be able to change that weight to have 1,100 produce $1,000.
Yes, I mean, you can change the weights. You
Weight.
would have to make them higher or lower if you
Yes.
mess up with the base.
Right,
But then if you lower the base
Yeah.
and then raise the weights.
Yeah,
You are underfunding the foundation of your education system because that foundation amount
It's
is what's
also
supposed to
based on
pay for
cost.
all the other stuff.
okay,
And so it's not just about what it costs to educate the quote unquote extra things. It's
Right.
what it costs to educate
okay.
the entire base, which includes
See,
teacher salaries. It includes, you know,
Now,
all
what
the
we are
things.
spending now is where Senate Ed started. They're saying right now it is costing us
But they backed into that number based on this year's spending, not on a cost-based analysis, not taking into consideration the full cost of education. And they also made up weights. They took
They
them from
made
a
up
whole
weights,
bunch of different
yeah.
places.
what I thought they said is they took our total ed spending right now, what we're spending.
Yes,
They divided that out. They got the weights that would produce that. I mean,
they picked
I
and
guess,
choose
okay,
the
but
weights
I
they
think
wanted.
what the sticking point is this House came out saying it costs more to educate kids than we are presently spending. Right? Their base is higher.
35.
Yeah, so it costs more to educate kids than we're currently spending. The Senate has said, we're spending what we're spending, and we're going to assume that we're adequately educating kids, and we're going to move from there. So yes, from the ideal where this is what we should be spending, they're starting.
I
at
don't
what
think
we
this,
are
I don't
spending.
think the House version is the ideal. The House
Yeah.
version is what we are spending. That's what it costs to educate kids. And I think that I'm not the right person to answer why the number is a little bit different than what the FY 26 to what 25 number is. Although we just passed, everybody's communities just passed new budgets for FY 26, which
0.6% increase.
right, so the 35 million may very well be that 5.6% increase. I haven't done that math, but I think that, you know, really to get at why that number is the way it is, we have to talk to Professor Colby because it's her model.
Well, I
Well,
know,
can I, because I have to go actually.
fine,
But can I make one?
yeah, and then I'm going to ask Julia, not now, but next time, can you help us? I think the question, I can see where there's legitimacy with spending what we're spending now. I guess what I'm hearing being questioned is that what it's costing us to educate kids right now? Or are there things that the House put in? So what we're spending now includes what the House put in. The House may have put in Richard. They didn't put in Richard's. I guess it's.
You know, the House took the numbers from Dr. Colby's memo after doing the cost factor analysis. So I think that one of the pieces that's worth keeping in mind is, essentially what the cost factor analysis is doing is it's looking at how much is currently being spent in Vermont. And analyzing it against outcomes. And so it requires, so when applying it in the foundation formula, it then shifts resources across the state. So the reason that the number is not identical from when you apply the cost factor analysis in the foundation formula to, and compare that against what was spent in FY 25 is you're looking at a redistribution of where dollars are going. So there's the communities that were spending lower amounts are being brought up, and the communities that were spending higher amounts are not being brought down by the same amount. It's a $35 million or whatever the number. That's the
So
wrong number.
she's not dealing with what individual towns are spending. She is saying overall.
She's looking at the FY, she's looking at the data from however many years back through to FY 24, I believe. And essentially looking at performing the analysis that Senator Hardy explained, that's looking at significant relationships when controlling for all other confounding variables. And those significant relationships are then being represented in cost adjustment. And then the weight is being derived by comparing the derived base to the necessary cost adjustment necessary, according to Dr. Colby, cost adjustment, and then the ratio is the weight.
Right, and I think, thank you, Julia, and I think you also have to remember that the education spending is based on the weighted students, and she's looking at actual costs of actual students in order to come up with those weights. So she's sort of undoing the weights to create and analyze what the weights should be, whereas looking at our education funding, right, our education spending is already weighted across the state.
And this is being done because the weights we just put in are set to give you X% more taxing capacity.
Right, so not all
We're
districts
now
are.
going to convert that more taxing capacity to hard dollars that it costs, which gives you necessarily a different number.
Yes.
And this is if everybody, all students did this, but we know that some towns did not use their taxing capacity to raise more money to provide additional services to their one English speaking, or English as a second language student. So when Dr. Colby does this comparison, she's assuming that everyone will get that $100 or $1,000
Yeah.
more. Whereas so that makes that bottom line higher than when you're starting with the present amount, when towns are not raising, some towns are not raising that $1,000 more.
I think that could be part of
That
it.
in
Yes,
English?
I think that could be part of it, that not everybody's using their taxing capacity.
Right.
They're using it for lower taxes, not
Right.
more spending on students.
Right.
And so,
And this assumes everyone will spend more on students.
right, but I don't think that the education spending this year and the amount that is necessary to fully fund an empirically based foundation formula are comparing apples to apples necessarily.
Okay.
There are differences across how the analysis is done. And I didn't run the regression analysis. I haven't seen her model, or at least not for a few years. And if the model is slightly different when it's for,
But we're doing something.
yeah, so.
What I'd say is Tammy Colby, I'd love to get her back in if possible, but I'm looking at her slides right now and her education cost function statistically models the level of resources needed for students to attain targeted outcome. I'm certain that within her analyses, there is some significance or that spectrum of error or variability in where her numbers came from. So her numbers are not concrete, cast in stone. I think what we need to also recognize is the macro picture of what we're working with here is looking back to Ryan Harity's slides. Over the past 4 to 5 years, we've seen 5,193 less students in Vermont schools. And we've seen an increase, 734 FTEs, of which 849, even more than that, were in support staff. So what I'm getting at is what the House came up with, which would be spending more for a declining student population. We're using those numbers, which have to have some play, some flexibility, is what we're really discussing here. I know we need to fund at the level that's necessary to educate kids to comply with Brigham, but I think we also need to realize that we might be spending too much as our student populations are going down.
Well, I mean, I think that's a fair analysis. And I think maybe running the numbers, asking Dr. Colby to run the numbers on using next year's numbers too, because the school boards just cut a whole bunch of positions, like hundreds of them.
Or 400.
Yeah, 400. So you know, that would change that analysis a little bit. I mean, a lot of it is coming off of that federal funding. And also she was using her analysis, using the data on what schools spent during COVID. And so
That's a good point.
you know, I think the other thing that is problematic that the Senate Education Committee took out of the bill, and John mentioned this, is the House had in, and the current law has in, we included in Act 127, was a recalculation of the base and weights every 5 years. That's really important to do, because as we hopefully create efficiencies, the base and the weights would change. And you know, one of the things that Professor Colby actually saw in her analysis, using updated data, going from the 2018 data to the 2024 data, is that there's no longer a difference in educating high school and middle school students. That those efficiencies now exist, in that there's not a difference, and we don't need those weights anymore. And that could happen over the years too, where we don't need some of the weights. Maybe we don't need the small schools weights.
We aren't
because
gonna have any immigrants, speaking of.
Margin of error, that was the term.
margin of error. So, you know, I do think though that she's the statistician, and she's the one that ran the model, and should come back in and answer these questions. I know Senator Beck, who's not here, has a ton of questions about it, and I've tried to explain it to him, but I think hearing it from her, who ran the model, is
Yes.
really
Be done by 6 o'clock. The Capitol Police want to know. They don't want.
Well, one thing that I would also like
We're
to
paying
know
them to
about that,
stay here, so we probably should
Is-
find out.
whether or not those two rates came closer together because they averaged out, or was it that the lower rate went up to match the higher rate? And that overall things increased.
I mean, that's a question for her, but what she saw is that there's not a necessary weight
That's good.
for high school or middle school in order. And another important thing about her analysis is that it's supposed to be the most
We need
efficient
weights
amount.
101.
So
Whatever
There's-
that means.
there's not supposed to, you know, there's
And I don't
no
know.
longer need extra money for high school students. We might need more money for students living in poverty.
Well,
because of
again,
that.
it's whether the overall increase to me is what's more important. Because it's, you know, it just seems to be almost a corollary that we have a rate increase at a certain rate that matches the decrease in the number of students that we have.
And a part of that is a function of size, where you used to have a teacher teaching 12 kids.
Mhm.
Now the teacher's teaching 11, and
Mhm.
over 3 years, that teacher is now teaching 9. So it's costing more per kid because you gotta pay a
I
teacher a
mean,
certain.
that's what it
amount.
looks like on
Yeah.
the surface of it.
I think
Obviously, a lot of
that's-
things going on underneath,
And
but
then you've got all the mental health issues and everything else. We have an interesting, there's a company. I Googled them. Sounds like they have some personnel issues, but they do online mental health counseling for
We've been in
students.
the building, right?
Don't know if they've been in the building. But it's Hazel Health.
There's another one that's been in the building lobbying health and wealth.
Oh, there is one that has some, no, but that's one kids can get in and do online. This one is you actually do telemedicine
Fuck that one too.
with a counselor, but there's some interesting things going out there that might be a better investment than hiring a parent to walk around with a kid all
Yeah.
day. So he doesn't hit everybody else, or himself. So, okay, we're gonna make the Capitol Police happy. We're going home.
Good. So